Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the third edition of the Climate Change and Sustainable Development webinar series. And this afternoon, we have an exciting topic. It's called Designing for a New Caribbean Climate. And this is part 3 in our Climate Change and Sustainable Development series. We are looking forward to an action-packed afternoon with 4 really awesome presenters from across the region. And we can't wait to get started. So I now turn you over to Mrs. Janice Brown. She is the heart and soul of CBS, and I put this webinar in her very safe hands at this point in time. Over to you, Janice.
Good evening to everyone. I would like to welcome all of you who are participating in this webinar. For the benefit of those who are joining us for the first time, the Center for Biosecurity is the sole entity at the University of the West Indies and within the Caribbean explicitly devoted to biosecurity. Biosecurity is defined as the science or practice of safeguarding lives and livelihoods, which yield a unique perspective on its importance to national and regional sustainable development efforts. The mission of the Center for Biosecurity is to support these efforts to assess, prevent, mitigate where possible, and to respond to any threat that could potentially destabilize Caribbean societies. We have a very exciting webinar today. All of us can identify with the threats of climate change, and we have 4 expert presenters who will present to you on various aspects of climate change. At this time, I would like to invite Mrs. Andrea Lewis, who is the officer in charge of the Office of Institutional Planning and Infrastructural Services here at Cave Hill campus, to introduce the webinar. Mrs. Lewis.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much, Janet. Permit me to share my screen. And take you back a little. This afternoon's webinar deals with the Caribbean built environment and climate change, and we're designing for a new Caribbean climate. One might recall last year during not on the sidelines, but very much in COP26 meetings in Glasgow, Prime Minister Motley from here in Barbados made the point that though responsible for fewer than 1% of emissions, Barbados and the region as a whole were experiencing the effects of climate change before most of those who are responsible for such climate change. She listed the following as the major climate change effects experienced by Barbados. She spoke of drought, water shortages, coral reef deterioration, saltwater intrusion into aquifers, sargassum and seaweed, floods, hurricanes. Among the things, what Ms. Motley didn't mention, but also exists as part of climate change are mean sea level rise, increasing thermal discomfort in buildings, and increased energy usage. Cashman and Nagdi, who were lecturers here at CERMES at UBK Field, in 2017, they noted that while the total cumulative ratio of greenhouse gases produced by Caribbean small island development states is negligible in comparison to the global north, the region is on the receiving end of its impacts, a similar statement to what Ms. Motley had made. Some time ago here at Cave Hill, we conducted a study among built environment professionals, the architects, the engineers, the contractors, regarding the barriers that they saw to climate change adaptation in the built environment. Their perspective showed that 65% of them felt that modern sustainable building practices resulted in slightly higher construction costs. 62% thought that there were delays in the construction period, while 56% felt that sustainable building practices resulted in significantly reduced operational costs than over traditional buildings. we spoke with them regarding the sustainable building standards that they might be aware of. And we can see that most of them were aware of the more popular sustainable building standards such as LEED and the BREEAM and ASHRAE. We asked them about the relevance of sustainability rating systems and what they thought. And most of them thought that the sustainability rating systems currently in practice were not relevant to our Caribbean environment. We asked them what features they have incorporated in what sustainability features they have incorporated in their structures. Most of them have done LED lighting and renewable energy systems, perhaps like photovoltaics. We asked them about sustainability in building codes, and most strongly agreed that sustainability features should be a part of Caribbean building codes. And most importantly, and what brings us here today, we asked what could the university do to promote sustainability in the built environment? And the most responses spoke about education. So that's why it gives me great pleasure this afternoon to introduce this webinar, and the four esteemed presenters who will speak to you about their varied knowledge and experience about sustainability in the built environment in the Caribbean, designing for a new Caribbean climate. Miss Alyssa Amor Gibbons is here, and she is an architect with Studio Amor Barbados. We have Professor Michelle Michael from St. Augustine campus of the University of the West Indies. Mrs. Heather Pinnock, who is joining us from Jamaica, and she's managing director at Lucia Caribbean Jamaica. And the only gentleman among us today is Mr. Randy Graham, and he is CEO of United Insurance. So I will turn it over to them now. Welcome them and welcome all of you to this webinar this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Lewis, for your introduction to the webinar. And I'm quite sure all of us are keen to hear of these expert presenters. Our very first presenter this evening is Professor Michelle Michael. She, as was mentioned, is a professor of urban and regional planning at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus, which is located in Trinidad and Tobago. She served as the coordinating lead author for the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the 6th assessment report entitled Climate Change 2022, Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerabilities, Small Islands, Chapter 15. Professor Michael is the Deputy Executive Director of the UWI Global Institute for Climate Smart and Resilience Development. She has been conducting research in small island development states for over 25 years on urban planning and human settlement, climate change adaptation, water management, disaster risk reduction, and integrated coastal zone management. She has over 120 research publications, including a book, chapters, scientific journals, articles, and conference papers. Professor Michael is engaged in several global initiatives and functions as a scientific steering committee member of the International Science Council, regional engagement partner of Future Earth Coast, UN Habitat University Partnership Initiative, and Vice President of UNESCO's Committee for the Management of Social Transformation. She attained her PhD in Urban Planning from the McGill University in Canada. Professor Michael will present on the subject, Urban Planning and Climate Change in the Caribbean. Professor Michael, your audience.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm just going to share my screen and go towards my PowerPoint presentation. Okay. Can you just confirm for me that you can? One moment. I'm trying to get the slide presentation open. Can you confirm for me that you're seeing my first slide, which says urban planning and climate change?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. So I have been invited to present on urban planning and climate change in the Caribbean. And I want to start by first introducing to the listening audience that in the Caribbean, we do have unique patterns of urbanization. We do have rapid urbanization. In some islands, you are seeing urbanization that will increase threefold in the next coming decades. There is, in fact, what you know as primate cities, which is that we don't have a well-developed hierarchy of settlements. So the capital city remains the main point of gravity for most rural urban migrants. We also have most of our cities that have historically been developed as colonial port cities. And of course, they're located on the coast. And in addition to that, they are in the low elevation coastal zone. And I'll unpack that narrative later on in my presentation. In many of our Caribbean islands, we do have a well-entrenched pattern of informal urbanism, largely the result of our colonial past, where persons who were made landless in the post-emancipation era settled on land that belonged to the state. Now, these are going to, the past is actually holding the key to the present and the future challenges we will face in the context of climate change. We can't get away from our history. So let's look, for example, at the Caribbean capitals. We know that they're low elevation coastal capitals. Those are capitals that are 10 meters or less below sea level. Or at 10 meters, certainly, or below 10 meters. And some of our coastal capitals are below sea level. Here is an example on the extreme left, Barbados. You can see the topography of Barbados is especially flat. You have Kingston, Jamaica. Again, you can see it's the coastal capital. So it's in the coastal plains, and Port of Spain, again, on the coastal plains. And this is where we have most of our economic infrastructure, our built development, and a high percentage of our population residing within these coastal capitals. So by most estimates, we have 14 million persons in the Caribbean currently living below 3 meters in elevation, and 22 million that reside below 6 meters. So this is problematic for us in the context of climate change. And as I mentioned, most of our economic assets, including infrastructure, industrial development, roads, ports, and so on, are within this very vulnerable coastal zone. Let me return to the science, first of all. What the Working Group 1 report said, that's the IPCC's report, is that there was observed warming with high confidence, the scientists were able to say, observed warming in our small islands, which has been attributed to human activity. The warming will continue into the 21st century, and there will be further increasing heat extremes and heat stress. And that's with high confidence. We are no doubt seeing and experiencing these types of observed impacts. Sea level rise will continue to rise around our small islands, with more so where there are higher emissions that we cannot contain. And that's where we are talking about the greenhouse gas emissions. In addition to that, we are going to see sea level rise coupled with storm surges and waves, which will exacerbate coastal inundation. So that is obviously problematic for capital cities and human settlements along the coast. We will see some shoreline retreat, especially where you have sandy beaches. Barbados is no stranger to this aspect of the narrative, where coastal erosion has been very active along its beaches. And what we are also seeing in the Caribbean, and certainly most of our Caribbean neighbors can attest to this, is that the small islands will face particularly more intense tropical cyclones. Although they may not be as frequent, they will be probably of the categories 4 and 5. And this will continue if we tip beyond the 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that's the science. It's well established in terms of impacts. I've attempted to summarize for you that there will be, and we have already been observing it, rising temperature. The impacts and vulnerability and risk to our urban settlements will include heat stress, mortality, reduced labor productivity. Sea level rise, we will see flooding. This is a slow onset impact with the melting of the glaciers, but it will exacerbate flooding in the coastal areas, create economic loss and damage, and can have mental health issues for those persons who have invested in properties along the coast. We are seeing flooding and the impacts of coastal erosion, drought, water scarcity, saline intrusion of freshwater resources, and of course, storms and hurricanes. In summary, we are seeing economic impacts on human health and well-being, which can include psychological trauma impacts on human health. And of course, there is the issue of food security and nutrition, water security that can have long-term public health implications. And of course, if there is no water, there is no food. And if we run out of fresh water, and that is something that we have to look very closely at. Some islands, as Barbados is in the top 15 countries in the world that suffers from water scarcity. So without that fresh water, there is going to be an increased vulnerability of its population. As I've mentioned, the hurricanes are causing damage. 70% of economic assets and 60% of our population are concentrated on the coast. The economic impact, for example, of Tropical Cyclone Maria in 2017 was roughly 225% of its gross domestic product. It means a lot of building stock is lost. And how does one recuperate? How does an economy recuperate if it is hit by a hurricane on an annual basis? So those are some of the real issues for us in terms of built development. There is, of course, floods and landslides occurring in the Caribbean, causing extensive economic loss and damage to our urban infrastructure and our urban populations, excuse me, living in the coastal zone. So the United Nations has identified 17 sustainable development goals. And the one most critical for us is the SDG 11, which speaks to sustainable cities and communities. What we are trying to do is to make sure that our cities are inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. So in an urban planning context, how are we going to cope with this? So we have several adaptations. Yes, we do have some bad news in terms of the climate change, but there are solutions that we can explore. These will include retreating from the coastline using coastal setbacks. So if it's right up on the coastline, the top illustration, you can push the building back. But of course, if you have limited land, how do you retreat from the coast? You can stay within the coastal zone, but then you have to elevate your buildings. You build them on stilts. And then, of course, you can do protection, which is to do coastal engineering. And of course, that's quite expensive. So just to go back, you can use a natural-based adaptation or solutions, which would include ecosystem-based adaptation with mangrove replanting and so forth. So you do have the EBA, as we know it for short, and infrastructure-based options. And I'll develop this narrative as we go along. This is just pictorially showing what happens with sea level rise. You do nothing, you stay there, the cost of damage. You can build a protective measure in the second one. You can stay there with the stilts, you can advance, but you will have to do some land reclamation. So you build up the land, or you can retreat, and you can do some retreat and ecosystem-based adaptation. The key point is there is no single solution. There's no silver bullet to the responses to climate change challenges and impacts. So we are going to see a mix of these measures that we can implement within the region. This is an example of what's been happening. You see the Palisados in Jamaica, where there was an attempt to shore up the sand spit so that there could be movement between the landward side and to the end of the sand spit where the airport is located. This one shows Barbados building seawalls, and it has a long experience within the Coastal Zone Management Unit to do the modeling, to determine the size of the boulders and so on to protect the coastline. And this is Havana, which has had a seawall called the Malecon for many, many decades, protecting the parts of Havana from the impact of storm surges along the Caribbean Sea. These pictures actually illustrate the ecosystem-based adaptation measures. So we do know in urban planning that if we do not protect our watersheds, we can in fact do damage to our coral reefs, and coral reefs actually on the seaward side buffer our coastal infrastructure. There is of course mangrove on the landward side. The coral reefs are on the seaward side, but the mangroves are on the landward side. And what they do is they filter land-based pollutants, and they help protect us from coastal flooding, but they also help filter pollutants from entering the coral reefs. Let me turn directly to orthodox urban planning. What can we do? Yes, we are doing things from the natural-based system and the engineering aspects where we speak to engineers when we have development plans. But we can use setback distances and site coverage standards to ensure that we have enough space around the building for groundwater infiltration and to reduce surface runoff, so you don't have full concretization of the site. The same applies with the setback distances, where you can maintain enough greenery and tree preservation so that we can reduce the impact of runoff in low-lying areas. We talk about building back better. When we have hurricanes, should we be building back better with hurricane straps, which we should be doing? It's mandatory in most of the Caribbean. Should we be using the hip roof as opposed to concrete roofs? We know with the concrete roofs, they're more stable and can withstand the impact of high winds, strong winds, but then they can also trap a lot of heat. And we are finding throughout the islands, people are speaking about more heat stress during the dry season. So yes, you can build back stronger, but the question is, can we build back faster? And I think this was presented earlier on. We need to look at how we can redesign buildings to ensure that we can withstand the impacts of climate change in the form of, especially in terms of minimizing the impacts of hurricane. What we've been trying to do in urban planning is to revisit how we plan our settlements. We have had a history of urban sprawl where our capitals are sprawling in a linear fashion in most cases. And we are revisiting whether we can look at compact urban form, like many European cities. What compact urban form involves would be medium density as opposed to low density urban sprawl. Where with medium density, you have smaller units, which will result in low carbon urbanization. We can also promote infilling of development where you have empty land within the capital rather than accommodate sprawl and eat up the rest of our green spaces. Also, by having compact urban form, you protect your rainforests and watersheds because you're not allowing sprawl to penetrate into these fragile areas. That will help with groundwater infiltration and help us cope with increasing droughts as we are seeing in the region. that it will also not only protect our freshwater resources, but it will reduce flooding in a low elevation coastal zone, consume less arable lands, agricultural lands, encouraging improved or enhanced food security and nutrition. And it can lead to better access to economic opportunities if you have a well-serviced urban core. And it will involve less commuting, which I think we are quite aware of the ill effects of long transport commutes to work. So reduced commuting, less air pollution, we can improve the walkability of our cities by providing better shaded areas and dedicated bicycle lanes as well, and reduce our dependence on the use of motor vehicles. In urban planning also, we have always said design with nature, and we are looking towards what is called the blue-green infrastructure, which would be the trees and waterways to help us have that impact in tempering the urban heat stress. That, of course, depends on using our indigenous knowledge and local knowledge, as well as science-driven policy. And we will, of course, have to embark on more robust climate change research to get the empirical evidence to present very cogent arguments for investments in blue-green infrastructure. So very quickly, these are the urban spaces. They are very good for carbon sequestration. They are lungs for our city. And this is an example of Havana. I am very impressed with what Cuba has done in terms of climate change adaptation. Open spaces, you know, beautiful foliage to provide clean air, to provide the carbon sequestration, and to provide shade for residents within the city. On the Carenage, you have the waterway, which actually helps reduce the impact of urban heat. This is in Barbados. And of course, there is that area known as the Savannah, a huge area of urban green space within our city of Port of Spain. Havana also has the use of the vernacular architecture with continuous walkway on the walkways that are well shaded. We have had them in the Caribbean, for example, St. Vincent and the Grenadines and the older parts of our cities. And we need to go back to how we can create that kind of urban space that is well shaded and provides relief from the midday sun and so on. Again, a look at our vernacular architecture. I know there are other participants on the panel who will speak directly to that, but the traditional architecture did help us cope with the urban heat. And I think we can certainly go back to, we have the ideas from indigenous building and the vernacular architecture. And so we should revisit these in the future. Whether it will cost more is another matter. And again, we will have to look at the empirical research. Here you can see buildings elevated on stilts to cope with flooding. And of course, the use of wood, which is cooler than concrete. In our case, where we have flooding, our infrastructure is all overground and it gets flooded out. And so our recuperation period after hurricanes can take a much longer period. So we as urban planners are looking at how we can bury the infrastructure underground, whether it's our electricity poles or telecommunication poles and so on. And those corridors can double as green spaces. As I draw closer to the end of my presentation, I think we need to improve our technical capacity to implement innovative solutions in our Caribbean cities. We do have solar and wind energy that is being experimented with in Jamaica and Barbados. We have the use of rooftop gardens and the waterfronts and coastlines, and we need to replicate this throughout our capital cities and other urban settlements. As I conclude, the philosophy and principles of urban planning are to protect public health and safety, ensure human well-being, at the same time protect the environment, and ensure equality for all, leave no one behind, and help to alleviate poverty. These are all synergistic principles, and we have always had this embedded in our site development plans and our land use plans. How we do it will be to work with integrating our spatial plans and policies with our sectoral plans. develop public-private partnerships, allocate finance for achieving these solutions, provide incentives, and work in a much more multidisciplinary an ecosystem rather than work in silos, and engage stakeholders at all levels. So we're basically talking about planners, the state and private sector, urban planners, architects, engineers, and so on, working together. So the new narrative for Caribbean cities in response to climate change would be to have transformative urban adaptation to support future solutions, multidisciplinary inputs, stakeholder engagement should be enriched and facilitated, improved public education and behavioral change, because a lot of our change is, and climate crisis we face is partly driven by anthropogenic activity or human activity. And of course, the big question is climate finance. How are we going to adapt, and where do we find the money if we are only contributing 1% of the world's greenhouse gases? Let me say that the scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and health of our planet. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss the brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. On that note, I thank you, and I will return to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Dr. Douglas.
Hi, good afternoon. Just want to interject here, and we just want to run our first poll. It's just 3 questions. We want to take some information from those in the audience so that we can improve our service to the region, to Barbados, and to the wider community. So thank you very much. Back over to you, Janice.
Our next presentation will be by Ms. Alyssa Gibbons. I have learned a lot from listening to Professor, but along with all the other participants, we are looking forward to the other presentations and the different angles that they will take. And all of your questions, your comments, you could post them in the question and answer feature or in the chat, and we will address them at the end of the webinar. So our next presentation would be by Ms. Alyssa Amor Gibbons. She is an architect and multidisciplinary designer of environmental conscious, energy efficient, and resilient architecture. Architecture that reflects a deep reverence for nature and for interconnectivity with the world in which we live. With an Masters of Engineering with honors in structural engineering and architecture, her dualistic background has fostered a passion for delivering architecture that is in constant pursuit of next level intelligence and optimization through synergistic design. As a lead and well consultant, she further infuses her designs with consideration for and sensitivity to a human-centric approach. Ms. Gibbons is also a TED speaker and winner of the TED Idea Search Latin America, A New Era, where she shared the importance of teasing architectural inspiration from indigenous vernaculars and how learning from the past can help shape a more secure future. In her boutique architectural studio, Studio Amor in Barbados, she designs with the belief that in our pursuit of one of the most basic human rights, the right to shelter, we should do so while stepping up lightly and as respectfully across our physical and cultural landscapes as we can. Ms. Gibbons will be presenting on climate change and neo-Caribbean architecture. Ms. Gibbons, your audience.
Thank you so much, Janice, and thank you everyone for having me. I'll just go ahead and share my screen now. And if you guys could let me know that you're seeing my screen.
Yes, we are.
Yes, we are.
Thank you so much. So I'm really excited to follow up after Professor Michelle, because I think some of the topics that she spoke about so nicely align and interweave with what I think is the future of architectural design, specifically for us within the Caribbean region. And I wanted to kind of take a slightly different approach with you today and take you through a bit of a small case study that kind of shows the way in which I work, and take it from a very small example into a more macro scale approach to design within the Caribbean. So I wanted to start by kind of framing out what I think is the first rule of sustainability, and that really is to align with natural forces, or at least not try to defy them. And the most humble example I can think of, sorry, can you guys still see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. And the most humble example I can think of is really a local vernacular within the Caribbean, particularly in Barbados, the Chattel House. And kind of following up on that idea of Indigenous architecture, local vernacular, and our shared history as colonial societies, I think looking back to the past and understanding what has worked and what has not, and where we come from as a people, and our inherent inventiveness by necessity really allows us to understand what is relevant for our context as we kind of take on modernism and contemporary design. And the Chattel House is a Barbadian vernacular, and I'm sure each Caribbean island has their specific comparison to this, but is really what I think is the first example in Barbados, at least, of resilient, temporary, but resilient architecture. And this stems from persons being displaced after the abolition of slavery and being forced to, one, withstand terrible weather, but still have the capacity to be able to move at a moment's notice. And from this early example of chattel housing is where I have kind of pulled a lot of my inspiration for the type of work that I do. And Professor Michelle had a slide there where she mentioned a bit about elements of vernacular architecture, including jalousie windows. And this is a quintessential example in Barbados that kind of does a couple of things that one might not expect just based on the simplicity of it. These horizontal louvers that you see here are really allowing wind to filter through the building and break up a lot of the force of the wind against the building's facade. People used to literally leave part of the house open during hurricanes, and that helped to break up some of the pressure differences between the external and the interior of the house, and was this kind of just nuanced approach to safety. So instead of trying to shore up the house against these high winds, or really focusing on extra costs or extra kitting onto the house, people did what they had to or what they could, which was to figure out how to work with nature rather than against it.
Excuse me, just not to break up your flow, but one of your windows is showing smaller and it's not at the full size. So I'm not sure if that's what you were asking about earlier. I mean on the computer. Oh, yes.
Is that better?
Oh, yes, that's
Thank you. Thank you for that.
No problem.
Something happened there, but I couldn't see for sure. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So this is a very simple example of how the jalousie window works, and it's really just allowing wind to flow through while keeping wind and rain out. And by aligning these apertures in the facade similarly on different ends of the building, you created this opportunity for wind to flow through the building rather than building up force against the external facade. And one thing that I've always found so curious about this is, how do these early examples of architecture perform? And one of the lessons that I learned in studying these and looking at different aftermaths of hurricanes throughout the Caribbean is that in some cases, it was not just about full survival of the building, but almost about bending without breaking. So that adaptability, that ability to, for lack of a better phrase, live to fight another day. So if this idea of working with nature is the first rule of sustainability, it begs the question, what is the second rule of sustainability? And within the Caribbean, I think that sustainability and resilience they need to become intertwined. I think for us, because of our because of our climate, we can no longer kind of treat these terms as separate, because for us, sustainability is the crux of resilience for us, because we are literally on the front line of a lot of the natural disasters and, fallbacks of climate change. So I wanted to take you through a very quick case study to show you, not just from words on a page, but an actual example of how you can go from this kind of first principles approach to architectural design and integrate that into a real life project. So this is a project that I worked on, that I led in Dominica following Hurricane Maria in 2017. And as you can all imagine, I'm sure all of us are touched in some way by natural disaster. And, after the hurricane, I was sent over to Dominica to assist the client in redeveloping their site. And for me as a designer, I think we get caught up sometimes in, doing this desktop analysis of what it means to be sustainable or resilient and what it means to do good design. But I think nothing beats being on site and understanding the landscape, understanding the geography, understanding, how the wind and rain moves across the sites. And that is something that is super important for me as I go about my works. And for this project in particular, one of the a bit of the feedback that the client had after having lived through and survived, this event, was that they could not fathom how they could protect themselves against the next events. And, in walking around on site with them, we kind of decided we can't for sure design out a hurricane, but what we can do is try to anticipate based on knowledge that you have directly on the site, understand how the building behaves. And that led us to a kind of counterintuitive approach. If you think of this idea of letting the wind through the louvers, we decided, is there a way to design this building in such a way that we can let the wind through the building? Are there areas that we may be willing to sacrifice, for lack of a better word, and create more critical, safe lockdown zones across the rest of the building, so that in the event of a hurricane, much like those early or endemic vernaculars, we could recess into certain spaces within the building and bunker down, be safe, and allow the wind to pass through. And like I said, I know that's quite counterintuitive, but that is the approach we went with for this building. So as you can see through the center of the building, this entire area remains exposed to the elements, and all furniture, all items are recessed into these safe zones and lockdown zones during the event of a hurricane. May not be super applicable to each use case, but I just wanted to give you an example of the design thinking that we are starting to integrate and explore. Similarly, for this pavilion building, again, the emphasis was on integrating the building itself into nature. And what you're going to see in a little bit is how we took that example of the louvers and integrated it into a facade system that is very low tech. I think easily accessible by anyone, whether you are a large commercial developer or someone looking to implement your first home, or perhaps some kind of amenity space on a hillside in a forest. It was just a very simple and I think very contextual approach to this particular project. And then looking at ideas for passive ventilation and passive cooling strategies, instead of trying to create a concrete box that's AC'd and fully watertight within this beautiful forest, we said, okay, how can we start to open up this building and enjoy the space that we're in, but still provide opportunity for, lower utility bills, natural wind, etc. and these are just some images of what we were able to achieve, but the overall approach was one of being very light on footprint, not trying to do too much, understanding the elements that we were working with, and allowing the building to breathe and integrate itself with the natural flora and fauna around it. And I wanted to show this image here because I think for me, this is one of the most, beautiful images of that describes what I'm talking about. We go from this kind of first principle example of a very simple architectural element, and we start to think, are there ways that we can integrate this into a more unique aesthetic? Can we take this element of slatted louvers and turn this into a facade design? Is there a way that we can allow light into the building within this forested environment, create this pavilion within the terrain, but still hold on to the elements that we have realized work specifically on this site? And you can just see here at the top as well, any kind of canopies that we introduce were all dismountable and able to be pulled within the building in the event of high winds. Now, this is just a very crude, very small, but I think successful example of the design thinking that we're starting to integrate a lot more. It's less about how beautiful you can make this building or how much money you can spend on modernizing a building, but what are the materials? What is the design aesthetic and approach, but also the human focused approach in putting together a successful building? And this is not just exclusionary to hurricanes. You know, colleagues across the Caribbean have started to kind of reflect on, you know, their local vernaculars within their country. This is an example from Trinidad. And rather than trying to, like I said before, modernize everything, I know in the Caribbean, everybody wants their wall house, but we're starting to think what actually works for us, what is unique or relevant to each site, and start to design in such a way that is less concerned about how beautiful the building is, but how it actually performs. Another great example, I'm sure most of you know, are the gingerbread houses in Haiti. And this concept of being able to withstand and bend and flex with the earth below and still hold true to, you know, cultural vernaculars. And this is another kind of very simple approach that we took with that same building that I spoke about in Dominica, where we started to take those elements that we knew worked for seismic activity and then create a digital twin. And I think the future of architecture is very much cemented in that realm of creating digital twins or building information modeling, where we're no longer designing in a 2D way. We are literally taking the building design and treating it almost like a virtual carbon copy of the built asset. So it's about taking the guesswork out of how the building performs. We're modeling and designing each element in that space where there is no loss of human life, where we can afford to get things wrong, because within that space, we can start to optimize the building itself. And this is another good example of how we can take what is a 3D kind of replica of the building and put it in a simulation environment where we can start to test wind loads against the building. We could put category 5 winds against the building and see how it performs or where it fails, where the opportunities to improve the design of the building, rather than waiting until it's too late, rather than waiting until there's loss of human life, rather than waiting until we are billions of dollars in loss and damage. And that's not just kind of focused on disaster preparedness. I think a critical component, as I think Dr. Douglas mentioned earlier, is about human comfort as well. I think as a designer, I don't want us to be solely focused on surviving. I also want to focus on the quality of life while we are surviving. Our post-recovery or before recovery is not just about a major event, it's also about, as Professor Michelle said, water scarcity, heat, understanding the quality of light within the space, and cost analysis. I think one of the biggest issues or biggest concerns and restraints that I have as a designer is a client who may have this idea that building in a way that may be deemed more sustainable or resilient is expensive. But if I can kind of take the building through its iterations in this digital environment and show cost projections and trade-off analysis and give a sense of what it would be if I, for example, change the ratio of glazing on the facade, what that would mean for the internal thermal comfort of the building. If I decided to include shaded elements on the facade, I can start to project what is the cost versus, say, running the AC less or paying to integrate more shading onto the facade of the building. Having this kind of control in the design phases is game changing for everyone because we're no longer taking a prescriptive approach, it's a performative approach. So we are taking the guesswork out of what would it mean if I built in this way. We can go through different iterations and analyze them not just on cost, which may be the client's main concern, but we can analyze them across the board, whether it be for the carbon footprint of the building through construction to handover, or just the baseline energy consumption of the building. We could have these different options and start to consider the different iterations rather than being stuck to one design because we don't want to either pay to explore different options or what have you. And then just in terms of the building process in general, this ability to go into the building and understand the different components of the building, understands, not just how much concrete my building needs to make up the stairs, but what are the other services within the building? Are they well coordinated? I kind of having this dollhouse view of my project before we start to pour concrete, or right now having to come and dig up concrete to put in an electrical box that somebody didn't put in before because it wasn't properly coordinated. So that's a level of control and understanding that we're trying to get to, where it's not just about the structural performance of the building or its resilience, but it's also understanding that the sustainability, the experience of the building is heavily tied into that at a holistic and synergistic approach. And then when it comes to handover of the building itself, this idea of the building information management and having that digital asset that is tied to the building. Imagine understanding everything about your building from the foundation and how it might perform in an earthquake to the grade of the lowest level and where your key equipment is sitting in relation to a floodplain, all the way up to the roof itself and understanding every element within that building, where it's coming from, whether it's coming from China or 50 miles down the road, understanding the carbon footprint that's tied to that, understanding the quality of light, heat, water usage, electrical usage within the space. That's a level to which we are now designing. And you take that idea within a building itself, and now you have this opportunity to expand this at a master plan or urban scale. So you're not just talking about a building information model, you're talking about a city information model. And because you have this kind of digital asset that now brings into play stuff like extended reality, where we can physically push and pull elements and buildings and blocks within the city and see in real time the impact it has on zoning, on traffic, on pedestrianization, walkability of the city. And we now have a sandbox of sorts where we are not just, like I keep saying, guessing about the urban scale issues. We're actually considering all of the variables at one time and seeing in real time how we're actually impacting our built environment. And one of the projects that I'm really excited to be working on right now is kind of focusing on this idea of the Caribbean as a first world group of cities. I think we all have this shared colonial past, and there has been this idea where we they used to call us lesser developed countries, and they started to call us the global south. And what I would love for us as a region, as the ones that are kind of in the front line, as we always say, of this climate crisis, to lean more on digital tools, to lean more on innovative solutions as designers and built environment professionals, to kind of create our own solutions out of the problems that we may not have necessarily created. And for me, that looks like urban regeneration, where we are improving existing infrastructure. We are looking for opportunities for urban regeneration. We are building the sandbox ecosystems, our digital solutions, where cities become almost charter cities within themselves, and they have their own governance centered around sustainability and resilience, where we're looking at digital urbanism, where we are not just, you know, a bunch of silo designers working on our desktops in 2D, drawing the next great building, but we're understanding what is the ecosystem of the city as we start to plug in these different, you know, residential areas, civic amenities, flood defense systems, you know, and then add to that a layer of smart city. When we have these digital assets, are we integrating the Internet of Things? Are we integrating sensors? Are we getting feedback from the city so that, again, is this extra level of information so that if I, as an urban planner, say, okay, we are going to pedestrianize this stretch of road, and we do a desktop study and everybody thinks it's a great idea, I want to know if it actually works. I want to have the feedback from the cars on the road. I understand where are the busy peak times. I want to understand what impact that has made on the rest of the city. I want to know if I give permission to build this new hotel, 600-room hotel on the pier head. I want to understand what impact does adding 600 new sewage, you know, lines into the city system, what impact does that have? I don't want to only be focused on we need more jobs in this economic climate. I want to know what is the impact for my citizens. And finally, placemaking, which is an interesting term, but really, for me, is about understanding the story of each island, each city based on the past, and kind of capitalizing and teasing that out of, or teasing that into the fabric of the city itself. And I think what was super exciting for me is that as a designer, yes, I focus on, you know, physical infrastructure buildings, but what gets me so passionate is that when you exist in this digital realm, when you've taken yourself out of just this 2D approach to design, when you start to layer information on top of each other, when you sit in rooms like this and hear input from, you know, academics as well, and understand that what you're doing at a physical level, whether it be for sustainability, resilience, is the same thing to me. Because you have all of this metadata, you can now start to overlay data about economic spending, agricultural productivity, water areas, and you have this atlas almost of information about all of these issues overlaid onto each other, so that now when I design something, I'm not just focused on building a 2-bedroom house for a client within their budget. I'm focused on delivering a space that is safe, that is usable, that is functional, and serves them well. And I've been getting a lot of questions from people asking me, you know, how did I get into what I'm doing, or was my passion about it? And it's not as altruistic as people think, because for me, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but it's this kind of principle where at the very bottom of this pyramid, you could think of it as like a human version of the food pyramid. And at the very bottom are our basic physiological needs, probably our biosecure needs of, you know, shelter, access to food. And at the top of the pyramid, you get towards self-esteem and self-actualization, which is really about fulfillment of purpose. As a society, as a Caribbean society, for me, in order for us to get to that pinnacle of thriving, we really need to solve this issue of survival, right? And, you know, I'll leave you with this last quote, and I hope kind of ties together me going from a childhood host to what I'm talking about now. But I think, you know, we're really at a point where we're designing for a future that we don't know for certain. And I think the only way to do that successfully is to be aware of the past and to really pull from the reverence of the past. Thank you.
Thank you as well. I'm a bit speechless, to be honest. I really enjoyed that presentation. It was captivating, intriguing, and it actually registered some conversations that I've had with some persons who had contacted the center regarding having a digital twin for the different islands across the Caribbean and being able to then utilize this whole digital twin concept to advance sustainable development. So I am totally enjoying this, to be quite honest.
We're small enough to do it.
Yes, I think so. And I really love Professor Maiku and how she set the foundation, examining those key concepts of urban planning, and then how you now, Alyssa, came and delivered on this aspect in terms of how do we utilize the traditional heritage, keeping that, but still in a functional way that is sustainable, so that we can still maintain who we are, but advance leaps and bounds. And who we have coming up next is Miss Heather Pinnock, and she's also another amazing presenter, having shared a panel with her before on a different symposium. But before I do get to Miss Heather Pinnock, I would like to launch our second poll at this point in time, so that we can have some engagement from the audience. And then once we've launched that, I will go into introducing Ms. Pinnock. So Ms. Heather Pinnock is a Jamaican placemaker. You would have heard Alyssa made mention to placemaking. Well, we have a placemaker, and she will tell us all about placemaking. And Ms. Pinnock is a Jamaican placemaker and a champion of sustainable tropical living. She is a development professional with formal training in architecture, urban design, and project management, as well as over 23 years of experience in construction and real estate. She is a graduate of the Bartlett Development Planning Unit at University College London and the Caribbean School of Architecture at University of Technology, Jamaica. Ms. Pinnock has worked across Jamaica as well as in St. Lucia and Trinidad and Tobago. Her experience includes master planning, energy efficient and net zero buildings, sustainable housing, and public spaces. In 2021, she concluded a successful stint leading one of the government of Jamaica's largest real estate management and development agencies, the Urban Development Corporation, or UDC, where she actively promoted making development happen sustainably. Ms. Pinnock was appointed co-chair of the Commonwealth Women in Planning Network in June 2022. She's also a certified Scrum Master and EarthCheck Design accredited professional and a licensed real estate salesperson. Her company, Lucia Caribbean, offers real estate advisory services with a focus on sustainable development and conscious living for tropical regions. And without any further ado, I introduce to you Ms. Heather Pinnock. Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. I am sharing my screen. Do let me know as soon as you see it pop up.
Yes, I see it. You just have to go to slideshow to, yes.
Are we in slideshow now?
Yes, we are. Thank you.
Okay, great. So yes, I'm so happy to be here today. My name is Heather Pinnock, as it was said, and I am absolutely delighted to always speak about sustainability, climate, and of course, real estate. Three things that I really am fascinated with and work with all my life. So let's get right into it. I want to talk from the perspective of placemaking to start with. And placemaking is about finding places and experiences, places that really change our lives and make our experience, our day-to-day experiences special. And I want to start with this quote, and it says that places where people want to live, and I've added work and play because that's the things we do, and that are sustainable, do not happen by chance. They are the product of visionary thinking and commitment by highly skilled civic and national leaders, by developers and professionals, and with the full engagement and support of local partners and communities. And this quote is just to remind us that there's no one person, no one skill that is going to lead us to the sustainable future. What we want to do is all take a focus, take a look at how we can adapt and work in a more sustainable way in everything we do, because everything contributes to a better future. So let me start by defining sustainable development. And here I'm speaking specifically of sustainable property development, but of course, this is the definition of sustainable development in general. And it very simply says it's about development which meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So this is a definition that has been used many times over the years. It's from way back in 1987, but I still think that this, in my view, is one of the strongest definitions of sustainable development. And so it's the one I use often. We want to be able to develop for today. We want to be able to fulfill our needs today, but we also want to not to do anything that compromises the ability of those who come after us to be able to do even bigger and greater and new things that we never even dreamt of. So let's get into sustainability. And I like to talk about sustainability as a very simple balance. And this Venn diagram shows a balance. You will also notice that this Venn diagram matches my logo for my company, Lucy, because this is the very core and essence of what we do. And that is looking at the balance of people, planet, and profit. And for something to be sustainable, we need all three to be in balance at all times. And that is so in terms of people, we want to look at our society, our community, the needs of our community, and recognizing special features, things like culture and our heritage. And then we look at our planet. We want to look at the earth and all of the goodness therein, all the resources that have been provided to us, all the things that we use, all the ways that we interact with our planet and use the resources of our planet, and how we can balance that with the other things we do. And finally, and this of course is very important when we're looking at it from in terms of a real estate and property point of view, we look at profit, because we do recognize that our economies need to be viable. We want to be viable, we want to be competitive. And so we don't discount that, we don't discount the economic aspect, but that happens with thought to people and planet, and that the three are kept in an equilibrium at all times. So this is the very core of how we want to look at sustainability. Then this, of course, leads me to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. As part of the global agenda for sustainable development for the year 2030, there are these 17 goals. I won't go into them with too much detail, but these 17 goals are all recognized globally as key parts of how we are going to take the world forward, how we as a world are going to be better and work towards a more sustainable future. And now to speak specifically about land construction, real estate, and property development, these are things that cut across all of these sectors. These are things that facilitate works and activity across all of these goals. And because of this cross-sectoral reach, the work that we do in looking at land construction, real estate is a powerful driver for sustainability and for making these global goals a reality. So now I'm going to speak very specifically about how the real estate industry, how property development relates specifically to these sustainable development goals. So there are a number of things, and some of them have been touched on before by Prof and Architect, so I won't go into them in too much detail, but how we look at land use patterns and how we use land. So before we even get to buildings, how do we use land? How do we plan out land? How do we design? What kinds of practices do we permit? What kinds of materials do we use? These are all major determinants of greenhouse gas emissions. The real estate industry, the property development industry is a huge contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, which are driving climate change. And so we need to consider that in everything we do. Construction and its end-of-life waste generation and disposal are also serious contributors to adverse contributors to our environment. The thing about building, and I always say to people, before you pour that concrete, be very, very certain of what you're doing. Because while it's easy to pour and while we see lots of buildings going up, it's not so usual that we see things coming down. So when you pour, expect that that building that you're creating is going to be there for at least 40 years and some much, much longer than that. So we want to make sure we make smart decisions, that we plan for the whole life of the building, not only for just its construction, but how it is used and how it will be, what will be its end of life, and what waste is generated in the preparation of the land, in the creation of the building, and all the way to its end of life. Then also the activities around planning real estate development and construction can have significant social, political, and economic tolls. And these are things we need to consider. We need to consider how planning and the decisions that are made have these deep ramifications in our society, because again, balancing people with profit and planet is key. Of course, one of the biggest outputs of our real estate industry is housing. And housing, which is shelter, is a major determinant of quality of life. And the whole point of the SDGs is to improve the quality of life of citizens on Earth. So we want to consider in everything we do in real estate, how are we addressing quality of life? And finally, I just want to touch on this one too. A lot of people work in the real estate sector, and that's everything from unskilled laborers to our highly skilled professionals. And we want to look at those opportunities and how we address things like human and labor rights and safeguards. All of these things are things we need to consider in terms of the real estate industry and how we interact with those sustainable development goals. So let me speak very specifically about how real estate is affecting our, how real estate is contributing to climate change. So 40% of global carbon emissions come from the building and real estate sector. 40% is a significant figure. 40% means that this is an area, property development, real estate development is an area that we must look at to address global emissions. Of that 40%, 70% of those emissions are related to the building operations. That includes things like heating, cooling, mechanical activities, largely how we use energy in those buildings. We're increasingly spending more and more time inside buildings. So increasingly the use of those systems and mechanical systems in buildings continues to be on the rise. 70% of those emissions are related to that. Another 30%, the other 30% of those emissions are related to the construction materials and the activities around construction. So that's everything from where do you source materials, how do they get here, what kind of energy or kind of emissions are created in the preparation of the materials, in putting them together, and all of that. So those are things we really need to consider as part of how we respond as a property and real estate sector to global climate emissions. Now here I want to share a quick quote from the World Bank about the impact of climate change. And this impact, it says that building fiscal and financial resilience and investing in preparedness, and that includes physical, health-related, and social safety nets, are critical to reducing the large human and economic costs caused by climate change. So here we're seeing that apart from the emissions and the things that cause climate change, we are seeing significant human and economic costs. Now, if we go back to our sustainability Venn diagram, we're talking about people and we're talking about profits. And we're talking about that they're at huge risk. And we haven't even touched on environment, which is obviously the biggest element, but the huge risk that climate change puts to how we currently exist on Earth and how we can respond to that. I want to touch very quickly on this campaign, 1.5 to Stay Alive, a campaign that I was very fond of and committed all my social media energy to back in the year 2015. COP21, small island developing states across the world, had this as their call to action, that we needed to keep global emissions below 5 degrees above pre-industrial levels in order for us to stay alive. We have seen since 2015 to now that that has not been achieved. And so there was a shift last year in 2022, COP27, where we saw that the conversation shifted simply from saying we need to cap it, we need to stay alive, to addressing what happens next. And what happens next and what came out of the last COP, most importantly, was consideration for loss and damage. And I think loss and damage and the loss and damage fund, which has been established, show us the importance of the built environment, of our property and real estate sectors as a response to climate change, because it's recognizing that the huge cost The huge cost to countries, the huge cost in terms of human lives is where we have loss and damage, where we have situations where climatic-driven events cause significant loss and damage in countries, particularly countries that are not the ones contributing to the problem. So some key policies that achieve that respond to the climate issues raised at COP and all our global considerations that impact the real estate sector include looking at rising carbon prices, building and resource energy standards, and of course, looking at renewable energy and net zero energy mandates. So I'm going to come quickly now to our Caribbean situation, very specifically about our Caribbean. Here in the Caribbean, and I won't go into all the details, we got some excellent data from Professor Maiku. We have 70% of our people live at or near sea level and in coastal settlements. In the Caribbean, we spend 50% of our year, that is half of our lives. Every year from June to November, we are in an active hurricane season where we're under clear and present danger of a tropical storm or hurricane. We don't think about it much, but I want you to pause and realize that that means half of our lives is spent under the threat of the possible threat of a tropical storm or hurricane. That is our reality. That is the reality we live with in the Caribbean, and that is our reality for which we must design and plan. And then the final statistic I want to share about our Caribbean situation is that 10% of our Caribbean economies, which is valued at about some US $22 billion, could be lost to climate events by 2050. Now, Architect Gibbons gave us a good example there of Hurricane Maria in Dominica. As we know, that single climate-driven weather event completely decimated what the country's GDP. A single event can set a country back economically a good 20, 30 years. And if you are constantly trying to recover from single devastating events, you will never be able to advance. And so these are things we want to consider as part of our unique Caribbean situation and how we respond in terms of our property and real estate development. Now, I want to talk very specifically about climate-driven property risk. What we're seeing happening in the Caribbean and all over the world is changes to what's happening in our built environment. We have increased flood insurances as we relate to things like sea level rise, coastal erosion, inland flooding. More storms mean more risk. We've seen things happening in places like Miami, which we refer to in Jamaica as Kingston 21 because it's so close to us, where flood insurance has become so significant, even to the point where some areas are unable to get flood insurance because the risk is increasing exponentially, so it no longer makes sense for them to be insurable. Then we have things like fires. This photo that I put here is a photo of Kingston, Jamaica, maybe about 2 weeks ago. For most of the month of March, Kingston has been on fire. The hills have been on fire. It has been raging fires in the hills all around the city for about a month. And the effects have been crazy. Not only has it affected air quality, made the place hot, ashy, but a number of properties were at risk. There are a number of properties in the hills that were on fire that were at risk. We have had to use up our limited water resources because we're in the middle of a major drought, but major water resources have been used to help out bushfires because that is also a clear and present risk. So these are some of the things that are increasingly happening in our real estate sector that we need to consider in terms of how the climate is changing our reality. We have increased costs in response to rising temperatures and deteriorating air quality. Again, more people are staying inside, so more people are using air conditioning, more people are using fans and using elevators and closing up buildings. And so therefore, in response to climate-driven events, and that drives up our energy costs. And just generally looking at major investments in increasingly high-risk locations. I'm just going to go back one slide to talk about high-risk locations. This picture I like to use when I'm speaking because this is a picture of the north coast of Jamaica. This is in St. Anne. And in this one picture, you see so much investment. Over on the left, you can see our North Coast Highway, large major highway that goes along the north coast of Jamaica, major national investment. Over on the right, you're seeing a hotel, and that you see one large hotel, but there are a number of other smaller hotels. And it goes to show you we have major private sector investments form of hotels happening along the coast, because as you can see, the sea is beautiful, it's bright blue, wonderful place to be, but we have to think about the level of risk with these property investments. Also in this picture, you're seeing some large housing projects. So there are large housing estates also going up along here, which means hundreds, if not thousands of people are moving here to live. And again, look how close they are to the sea. They're fulfilling my first statistic there, about 70% of people living at or near sea level in coastal settlements. These are the things that we must think about in how we address climate-driven property risk. So I just want to speak very quickly about how we can be climate smart in our real estate and property development activities. So the first, I think, and the most important is always writing in climate resilience and climate responsiveness and sustainability as a key part of any investment strategy. A picture here is an example of the Courtyard Marriott in Kingston, which is LEED certified, our first LEED certified building here in Jamaica, but it's the first but not the last. So we have other LEED certified buildings, including hotels, but beyond hotels, we have supermarkets, we have labs, we have a variety of building types looking at how they can be more sustainable. And this looks at everything from energy to water use to air quality. And these are the kinds of things we need to consider as we continue to invest and develop in our real estate sector. In Jamaica as well, we've had an outstanding example up at the UWI Mona campus of a net zero energy building. I'm very pleased to have been a part of the team that completed that net zero energy prototype building at UWI, and that shows us that it can be done. And apart from the prototype, there are actual real building. There's a home in Antigua which recently won an award for the quality of its net zero planning and organization. And so it's something that is happening, being done, and can be done across the Caribbean. Things you want to look at again, of course, are always conservation and management of all resources, primarily water. And in Jamaica, we're going through a drought, as I said. As Professor Maiku mentioned, Barbados is one of the most water scarce countries in the world. These are things that when we have it, we don't think about it, but when we don't have it, they can be devastating to us. And again, thinking of circular economies, which is everything from the concept of the building, every material that comes, all the waste generated, how do we manage that for the whole life cycle of a building? And finally, just to wrap up my short presentation here, I want to go from thinking in the future and the high tech and all the climate smart things we can do to looking at traditional sustainability and risk management. And again, here I'm going to hearken some of what Architect Gibbon spoke about, which is sometimes we know the answers. We don't necessarily need high-tech new things to solve it. And there's a lot of responding to, and the subtitle of this conference is Responding to a New Caribbean Climate. And I want to suggest that the new Caribbean climate is just an intensification of the old Caribbean climate. And if we look at some of our traditional responses to the climate, we may be able to address some of those risks. So this little house has so many cool features. It just looks like a simple house, but the roof is designed to respond to the wind, to respond to heavy rainfall, to get that rain to be stored over to the left there in the cistern. The presence of the veranda means that the inner rooms are kept cool. The sunlight, the pretty fretwork filters the sunlight so you don't get direct sunlight. Again, louvers allow you to address the airflow, as you saw again with Architect Gibbon's details. Rainwater collection, the structure is elevated to keep you off the mosquitoes, to keep you up above flooding, and of course, windows all around so you get cross ventilation. So I just want to say that in addressing property management, in addressing real estate development, there are lots of new and high-tech things we can look at, but I also think it's very critical that we just look at where we've come from and some of the traditional things we already know. So in short, we do the best we can until we know better, and when we know better, we do better. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pinnock. Another exciting presentation. I like how you went into the concept of placemaking, which I'm not sure if everyone has had the experience of it, being exposed to it. I find it quite fascinating. Being able to create spaces, much like how you would create a building, also from the grander scale of urban planning, and how we can integrate all of these really wonderful things together. So we've touched on the foundations of urban planning, the key tenets of it. We've expanded in terms of what, from a practitioner's point of view, how we can do that, incorporating some of the old with some of the new and exciting features that we have. And then we understood to the evolution of real estate in the Caribbean and the risk that comes with that, the wet side of climate change, flooding, but also the dry side of climate change with the wildfires and the risk that pose. And all of this can present a risk that leads to increased costs. And then now we will come to that last presentation, and that surrounds insurance, something that we know we need, but oftentimes we are quite hesitant to get, but it's very essential. I believe that persons living in the Caribbean do get insurance, and not only for one particular risk, but multiple risks that can eventuate. And before I introduce our next speaker, I just want to bring attention to the poll that we have at the moment. Those who are still on the call, if you haven't completed it, could you kindly assist us by completing it? So I'll introduce to you now our next speaker, and this is Mr. Randy Graham, and he is the CEO of CG United Insurance Limited, and he's currently the Chief Operations Officer of Carlyle Group Limited for the Caribbean. He's also the Director of the Insurance Association of the Caribbean, IAC, the Director of the General Insurance Association of Barbados, the Director of the Barbados Stock Exchange, and as I mentioned before, the CEO of CG United Insurance. Mr. Graham has served as the CEO of the Financial Service Commission, FSC, in Barbados, where he was responsible for the strategic vision of the organization, which regulates, supervises, and monitors non-bank financial system, inclusive of the insurance, pensions, credit unions, and securities sectors. His experience is in the financial and insurance industry. His experience in the financial and insurance industry is extensive, as he was also the Director of Insurance and Pensions at the FSC and General Manager of Insurance Management and Professional Service, IMPS. He's a trained risk manager and also lectures at the University of the West Indies in the Cavell School of Business, the Insurance Institute, and the Credit Union League. He holds a BSc in Insurance and Finance from Missouri State University, a Master's of Science degree in Risk Management from St. John's University in New York with honors. His awards and scholarships include the Spencer Education Fund Scholarship, the St. John's University Graduate Research Grant, and the Dean's Distinguished Scholar Award. Mr. Graham was the first person in Barbados to be conferred as a Barbados Chartered Insurer. And I would also mention he was also a very prodigious batsman in his younger days. Over to you, Mr. Graham.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dr. Douglas. And let me try to get the share to work. I mean, this presentation has been such an interesting and educational one. I almost feel as though I should be paying for the presentation, but I mean the presenters before us were so eloquent and so spot on, and I think credit must also go to the organizers. And we started with the science in the first presentation, we went to the architect in the second, and then the property specialist in the third. My job, fortunately, is the easier one. I just have to talk about how we're going to pay for all of it on the investment side, and then pay if there's an unfortunate catastrophe at the back end. So I'm just the capital, and I do intend to be mercifully brief in the presentation. I know that there is a bit of a Q&A after, so I'll try to get through my slides as quick as possible so we can get to the Q&A. But as I said, a lot of the work has been already set up on the science before and on the architecture. So what I will try to just show in a very practical way, in a very brief practical way, is how it all ties in to the need for insurance, the need for the capital, and how we get that money back into the Caribbean for rebuilding after the catastrophes, and why climate change and particularly global warming is presenting such a challenge to capital and financing in the Caribbean. So I'll start with a graph here showing the evolution of a hurricane, and then the paths that they've taken. Now, in the science presentation, it was already established that global warming is real and significant. And many people have heard in recent times about the impact of climate change and global warming on us in the Caribbean, particularly the hurricanes. And again, in the earlier science presentation, it was confirmed that we will get stronger hurricanes. Now, as many on the call are students and have an inquisitive mind, some people might be interested in exactly what the hurricane is and may even want to venture into experiencing a hurricane. But believe you me, we've responded to every major hurricane in the Caribbean in the last 40 years. You do not wish that on your worst enemy, and you do not want to live through or experience a hurricane in no form or fashion. It is a completely devastating natural event. So best to read about them and watch them on the news, but you do not want to experience one. But what exactly is the hurricane, and why does the heat and the global warming and the waters in the Caribbean create hurricanes? So at a very, very, very simplistic basic physics lesson, like we know of hot air, it will rise and it will cool and it will drop, and that consistent rising and cooling and falling creates the convection currents that can lead to the formation of a hurricane over the ocean waters. So it happens across the ocean waters because when the waters get warm, you do get that heated air rising, cooling, and falling, and creating the convection. Now, if you think very briefly to say boiling water in a pot at home, when you put the pot on a lower flame, eventually water will get hot enough to create the steam, and you may even see the steam rising. Now, if you put that on a bigger flame, a heavier, a wider flame, and the water gets hotter, it can get so aggressive that sometimes the pot cover rises, right, and can come off of the pot itself. It's the same concept with the hurricane and why global warming is impacting us. So if the earth is getting hotter, the water is trapping more of that heat. We are getting hotter waters. We're creating more, stronger convection, and bigger, stronger hurricanes are forming out in the ocean as the ocean temperatures increase through the water trapping, the increased heat from global warming. And that is what we are seeing on the right side of this graph, the evolution of the hurricane from waters across the Caribbean. The heated waters, again, is why we have the hurricane season, because in the summer months is when the waters are off of our coast become warm enough to create this convection. Hence, we have the hurricane season. Now, the graph on the other side of the, I don't know if it's your left, the other side of the screen, what you see is a bit of a world map, very simplistic world map. There's green areas covering landmass, and then there's orange areas. The orange areas is where we have the formations typically of tropical storms, cyclones, called typhoons in some areas. In our area, they're referred to as hurricanes. So you will see that they only go through a particular area, land space or area space or water space on the global map. But what is also interesting is that, again, in science presentation, we heard references to our region, the Caribbean region, only producing, less than 1% or somewhere around 1% of the global emissions, yet still we are having global warming. Most of the emissions are actually coming from countries that have the green land space on our graph here. So what you see intuitively is that in the green developed areas creating the global emissions, they are not the ones faced with the hurricanes. They don't have the hurricane belt. So they're creating the emissions in one place of the globe, but we are feeling it. Hence why COP and the Barbados Prime Minister, among with others, are talking about contributions towards it. And it's not just it is not a whim or fancy. There's science behind the request for the contribution, in that the emissions leading to global warming are coming from other areas, but we in the Caribbean are the ones facing the strength of the hurricanes, and therefore there should be some consideration for the fact that we are feeling the effects of what's being produced in other areas. So you get the global emissions in other areas, the heated waters in our areas, bigger, stronger hurricanes coming to us in the Caribbean on the basis of that, and that's what we now have to live with. Now, if you go back into history again, this is a history of Category 5. So again, the science spoke to maybe less frequent storms in the Caribbean, but stronger storms. So if you see in the 1920s, 30s, none in the 40s at all, we don't, as we have come through time, we have not seen that many or that frequency of the Category 5 hurricane, the stronger hurricane. Roll forward to 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, we've had Category 5s in 2020, 2021, and 2022. What you're seeing is an increased frequency of Category 5 hurricanes driven in our region again by the increased warming in the waters. So we are getting an increased frequency of the stronger hurricanes in our region due to the increased warming of the waters, which is linked to the global warming and the climate change that we are seeing. So again, in our property specialist presentation, we heard about the 1.5 to survive. If we cannot control the increases, what the future may hold for us, continued increases in global warming, leading to continued increases in the water temperatures, more stronger hurricanes for us to have to deal with in the Caribbean region. And remember, that belt is one in the Caribbean region. Not everyone is exposed to those hurricanes. This graph is a graph of the paths of the hurricanes in the 2022 season. One of the interesting things about the 2022 season and the hurricane paths is that we saw hurricanes coming through the Caribbean region, but now going further north into almost into Canada and some of the other northern territories. Not a phenomenon that we have seen, historically. But you could imagine if the waters going north from Bermuda and more continue to be warm or get warmer with the global warming, we can now not just see the strength of the hurricanes increasing, but now the past hurricanes are living longer because they have warmer waters all over to feed off of. It's not a very happy thing to think about, but it is the reality if we cannot control the warming and we continue to see the climate change. So again, I promised to be brief, so I'm going to move quickly into the capital side of it, right? So we have established that we can get these hurricanes in the Caribbean region. We established that they can be very strong. What do they cause in the form of damage? This is an estimate of the properties that we have insured in the Caribbean region, and that is from Guyana in the south up to the Eastern Caribbean chain, across the north from Antigua, Bahamas, and over into Jamaica and Belize. And this is not total property, this is insured property, and this is representative of about 20% of the insured property that we have, and that's $23.9 billion of properties that we have insured, and that's representative of 20% of the insurance market. So in total, we suspect that in the Caribbean, up across the chain, we are talking about just over $115 billion in property that is insured by the insurance companies in the Caribbean. That's Barbados dollars. So if we convert it to US for the conversation, we could be talking about anywhere between 55 to $60 billion of property insured exposed to these hurricanes. When we lived through Hurricane Maria in Dominica, we saw in excess of or very close to $1 billion of losses in Dominica from that one single event, and they can get very, very material. So it's not just the amount of value that we have exposed and the damage that can come from hurricanes, it's the length of time that it will take to recover on some of these hurricanes. So for insurance companies in the Caribbean, we have a feature where many of our insurance companies are not public companies. So the capital base of the insurance company is small relative to that 23 billion that we were talking about. Because we have not raised the capital to cover all of the property that we insure, insurance companies in the Caribbean rely very extensively on the use of reinsurance, which is capital coming from the European companies predominantly to repay some of the claims that we have from hurricanes. It is done simply because we do not have the capital base in the Caribbean to respond to losses of that magnitude in a short time. We simply do not have the cash in the Caribbean. So we rely on reinsurance to be able to respond. It has worked well for us in the past. We would love it if we had access to this capital in the Caribbean for insurance, but we simply do not. As an example of how it works well, in the Dominica after the Hurricane Maria, we put $500 million of cash back into Dominica for replacement of the property within 90 days after Hurricane Maria. If you had to take that out of our savings, if you had to take that out of our access to savings, it would not be a feasible way to respond. So you can imagine your own house. You've just gone to the bank. You've got a mortgage to build your house, and you set up to repay that mortgage. A hurricane comes and destroys your house. Where does the money come from to rebuild? Now we have the architect talking about what we need to do to rebuild, but how do we fund that? If you're already mortgaged out on the first house, where do you get the funds from to deal with the repairs and the rebuild? And this is really the benefit of insurance and access to the alternative capital starts with. So if you have the savings to rebuild your house, great. You use your savings, you still have to pay back the ongoing mortgage. If you don't have the savings, it means a second mortgage on the same house. Again, not very feasible. Insurance becomes a very viable option for funding the repairs of losses from a hurricane. So we don't like to pay the premium, and we understand that. But when we have the damage coming through and we have to fund it, it is a very useful option for funding the repairs of property from the hurricane. And we have been doing it since the 1700s. So it has survived the test of time as a not well liked, but very efficient way of putting capital back into person's hands to be able to respond to these strengthening and growing hurricanes. No, let me just go to, as I said, I do want to give the panelists and the folks on the call time to ask questions of our esteemed panelists. So I just will move swiftly to this last slide where we're seeing the real impacts that climate change are bringing on Caribbean economies as it relates to the insurance sector. So the issue is a very important one for the insurance sector for a couple of reasons. Insurance is on your property, on your house, is done on what we call a sum insured value. So if you build your house for $100,000, more often than not, you insure the property for the value that you have built the house for, which is fine. But when we have to rebuild your house after a hurricane, the value of that house is very done on the replacement cost. So again, if you go back to the architecture presentation, we looked at historical construction and we look at new construction and we see the changes in construction. We see the issues of hurricane ties. We see the issues of raising property. All well and those are fabulous things to add, but they do also add costs. So the cost to rebuild your house tomorrow is always going to be more than what you built it for originally. The replacement cost is always going to be more, particularly on property, of your initial build cost. That's why, again, we do encourage persons to look at the replacement cost of your house when you are insuring. So we have two problems. One, most people don't buy property insurance because they believe that God is coming from whichever country you live in, so you will never have a hurricane. That's not always the case, so we have to protect ourselves. But then the other issue is that more often than not, we insure the property for a lower value than what it will cost to replace or rebuild. So again, what we end up with in the Caribbean is a significant protection or funding gap for replacement after hurricanes. So in short, you need $200,000 to rebuild your house, but you've only insured for 100. You're gonna, even with the insurance payment, you end up with a funding gap of the additional 100,000. And this is the challenge that we find in every Caribbean territory following every major hurricane. There is a significant funding gap and a lack of protection for insurance on a whole, but even with those insured, we have the funding gap on the values, right? And that shortfall more often not pushes to the government to try to assist the public, and our Caribbean governments are simply not in a position to fund these type of repairs. So we have the science telling us that the climate is changing and hurricanes are becoming stronger. We have the architecture telling us what we need to do to build for the future, and we have the property specialists telling us what we really need to contemplate when we're dealing with our properties. And what the capital and the insurance is saying to you is that you do, this issue of climate change is not only impacting the economies, and it does impact you personally with your ability to have proper shelter in the future should you have damage. And we have to start contemplating how we're going to repair and rebuild the properties in the Caribbean. And that the best part of that comes from insurance. And I think that's where we would want to propose to end this particular conversation so that we can get to the Q&A, if that's okay with you.
Good. Thank you very much, Mr. Grimm, for showing us the mechanisms of insurance, the importance of it. And that funding gap is something that's very real. I know when you first purchase your home, you're given the premium for that insurance. And oftentimes, persons do not increase the value of the insured value. They keep paying the same premium year after year after year, even though the property value is increasing. So that is a very, very salient point that I think needs to be communicated to the wider public more. And I think that is obviously an area where we can improve on. So there's several things that I think that have come up with this webinar event, and I really thank you, all of the presenters, for an amazing job. It has been quite informative. I am struggling my head is buzzing with so many ideas. I'm trying to see how I can capture it, but I'm even thinking that maybe we should, as a group with the presenters, see if we can develop a short little policy paper of key things that we believe we could, posit before some of the governments that would be impactful and would definitely help to improve the resilience within the Caribbean if you're so minded. Now, I want to again request with the persons who are still on call to see if you can finish the second poll. I just want to have one housekeeping before we get into the Q&A. Professor Lord has been there waiting patiently. This is FSS Open Week, the Faculty of Social Sciences. So I just want to give him an opportunity to just greet everyone and to just give his very brief remarks before we launch into the Q&A session. So Professor Lord, are you still there? Okay, I'm not sure we're getting him on, but I just want to encourage you, if you can, check out the UW-IKFL campus website and also the Faculty of Social Sciences. This is the Open Week where we are showcasing all of the different programs, the different departments, institute centers that the faculty has. And we want to encourage you to go and subscribe and see what they have to offer. Now, going into the questions. So I want the participants and also maybe the panel as well to kind of think of where are the policy gaps that exist that we can kind of hone in on. Because to identify the problem is one thing, but how do we now move forward in terms of plugging some of these holes? It's not going to be an easy endeavor, but I think that while we frame the problem, we should also frame the potential solutions that we can find to assist governments, to assist communities across the region on how do we get to where we all want to get. So I'll go in the Q&A and I'll pick out the first one. This is from Mr. Robert Stewart to Miss Alyssa Amore. Have you considered using some sort of life cycle cost analysis to capture the full economic benefits over the costs associated with sustainable building development over the building's lifespan? So I guess that comes to your very creative and beautiful renditions, digital renditions of the analysis as it relates to risk analysis.
Yeah, we typically do life cycle analysis on projects, not just for projects that we have designs, but also as a consulting service, particularly for some of the lead projects that I work on. I also consult throughout South Florida on lead certification. And what we do with the life cycle analysis is not just about cost, it's also about carbon footprint. So kind of looking at every element of the building from essentially from procurement right over to handover, and then the not end of use, but kind of facilities management of the process. And I also say that we don't just consider projects anymore from cradle to grave, which is end of use, but from cradle to cradle. So also the opportunities for reusing, designing for deconstruction, and reusing finishes, materials from the project itself, and understanding what is the overall kind of decarbonization opportunity for the building. So in short, yes, we do use life cycle analysis.
Excellent, thanks very much. And I think that also raises an issue that we were discussing before, Ms. Pinnock. I think you had shared on social media about, I think it was a Japanese architect who made reference to the reuse of some of the dilapidated building stock that we would have rather than trying to create new sites of real estate, because that also affects groundwater recharge. That also impacts on flooding, because if you have a lot of dilapidated buildings that are just there and obviously the rainfall is not being absorbed by the soil, then you're not going to get the aquifer recharge, particularly in countries that are as water scarce as Barbados, being the 15th most water scarce country. So these are some things that I think we could perhaps look at, and maybe parts of policy that we could flag for some of the senators, some of the parliamentarians across the Caribbean to kind of contemplate and maybe see how we can do that better.
Let me just jump in real quick.
Yes, go right there.
So that article you were referring to, I think I posted it on Twitter. I can post it under the event, on the LinkedIn as well. But what he was really talking about is that throughout history, we have associated building bigger and larger with economic progress, and that we need to stop associating the idea of large buildings and edifices of all sorts as a marker of progress, and that some reuse and different ways of building are important. Again, as a real estate developer, an agent too, I find adaptive reuse is super important. Right now we have a hotel in Jamaica that was stopped operating from during the pandemic, and a hotel is a big thing. What do you do with it? And it is currently being converted into a kind of commercial and lifestyle campus instead. And what it does is it gives opportunities for lots of small businesses to get small offices, because hotel rooms are fairly small, but more and more businesses are also fairly small with 2 or 3 people, as opposed to a lot of businesses which were 50 to 100 people. So now we're looking at a different way of how we use buildings. So instead of tearing that down and doing something new, we're finding ways to do adaptive reuse. And that's essentially the theme behind that article that you're referring to. You know, let's not mark progress by only building shiny new things. Let's also look at how we can reuse what existed before. Like Alyssa just said, from cradle to cradle, you know, it may be the end of one purpose and use, but it may be the start of a completely different new use that doesn't require me to demolish everything, cart away all of that previous cement and materials, and then bring a whole new set. How can we do that in a more efficient way? How can we address that in a more efficient way? So those are some of the things to look at. I will find the link and post on the event.
Okay, thank you very much. I see
No problem.
Professor Michael has her hand up. Go right ahead, Professor.
Yes, I am just responding to your question about what are some of the policy gaps that we can highlight for decision makers. I think what has certainly come out from all the presentations very powerfully actually is that we do have in the Caribbean ways of coping with natural hazards such as hurricanes, but those can serve to help us become resilient towards the climate change impacts we're seeing. And I said that in my presentation, there's no need for us in all cases to reinvent the wheel. We do have tried and tested ways of dealing with the kinds of events, extreme events we see in the Caribbean. What I'm thinking in terms of articulating to the decision makers is that the vernacular architecture has served us well and has stood up to earthquakes and so on in the past. Now we do have a new Caribbean building code, and perhaps we need to revisit how we can use that building code with the older building technologies and come up with something that we can help us cope with the climate change. I think that's an area that needs to be revisited. There is another policy gap, and I didn't have time to unpack the narrative there. But when you consider the extent of informal urban development, squatting in the Caribbean, it is extensive. A high percentage of our population in many parts of the Caribbean is squatting and falls outside the regulatory framework. So the planners do not have an opportunity to ensure that the structures are built in compliance with site development standards and other development standards. So how do you deal with squatting to help those households and their various structures withstand extreme events and so on? That's a policy gap, an area for research. We will have to do some retrofitting. I don't think we can relocate everyone. It's very expensive. I think none of us on this panel is short of ideas. I mean, when you look at the expertise that you've assembled on this panel, we have a high percentage of ideas per capita in the Caribbean sitting right here. The real question is, how do we navigate the space in which we have to work and help our ideas become mainstreamed into policy, but more so translating the policy into action? I think this is where we have to move quickly.
Yeah, I completely agree. I had seen another hand go up. Was it Mr. Grimm? You had your hand up, or was that an?
No, I was going, but I think the professor covered it, so no need to interject. That's fine.
Okay, no problem. Thank you very much. So yeah, these are some critical points that are being made. I know, for instance, even and though we focus a lot on the actual building aspect, I think also the aspect in terms of urban planning from land use management is also just as important, because the way how we manage the land use also impacts, the efficiency of the buildings, how the comfort levels. For instance, I know, for instance, in Barbados, we have a policy in place at the moment where if you want to take land from out of agricultural production and into residential before you split it, cut it up into lots to sell it as real estate, you have a particular time period where there is inactivity on that land. And when that land is inactive and when there's rainy season, a lot of the vegetation grows. Then when the dry season comes around, we have a lot of dried biomass, which is the vegetation that is then at a higher risk for wildfires. And so how do you engineer the policy in such a way that persons don't mismanage the use of the land, and you don't then increase the risk of wildfires? It's also a public health hazard. You encourage the proliferation of vermin, rodents, mosquitoes, so dengue, leptospirosis, all of these other infectious diseases then increase. So we have to look at it, I think, in a very holistic manner. How do we strategically tease out some of these salient points, engineer the policies in such a way that we don't try to solve one problem, create 2 or 3 more future problems, and that can only happen when we have wide discussions, wide stakeholder engagement, and bring everybody as much to the table. Because one thing that fascinates me personally is that whenever there's a hurricane, a disaster, the entire country, region comes amazingly together. I love it. But then as soon as the disaster disappears or the impacts are reduced, we all shrink back into our silos. And then we try to solve the problems that are within our disciplines in the same way. And I think we're missing an opportunity where we can harness the momentum, where we have that wide cross-sectional and cross-disciplinary approach, and continue to use it and utilize it throughout. That's just my personal humble opinion. Professor Michael, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to make an intervention. While we were talking about buildings in some of the presentations in the context of urban planning, when we talk about land management, of course, we deal with buildings in terms of approvals and so on. But when we talk about land use management, what we're really trying to do is protect nature. And I think what has to be articulated very forcefully is that when we protect nature, we are going to protect ourselves from some of the climate change impacts. And that is where I made the entry point about ecosystem-based adaptation.
EBA.
Yeah. Now, they're slow to respond, but they are not as costly as the engineering structures, which are costly to build and costly to maintain. And in the Caribbean, we don't have a very good track record for maintaining infrastructure. So that's the reason I said, mix it up, use nature-based solutions as well as the engineering structures, but engineering only when it's very urgent that we respond.
Point taken, point taken. So we do still have some more questions to go through. This one is from Dr. Antonio Joyette. Do the digital assets of building information also contain suggested maintenance schedules for appliances, fixtures, etc. installed in the building? Further, what building safety information would be suggested to be made available to the public, either within building or online? So I guess this probably relates to Ms. Gibbons' presentation in terms of digital assets.
Yeah, let me just read again so I make sure.
Yeah, don't worry, it's quite a bit there.
The first part of your question, yes, within the model itself, we can apply a significant number of metadata points to each element. So for example, I can look at the light gauge steel within the structure, and to that element, I could apply the manufacturer, the distance it has come from, tie a kind of cost analysis to both transport, carbon footprints. Then for, say, the gypsum board finish and the paint applied to it, if it's a specific kind of fire resistant boards and it needs to be wiped with a specific type of chemical or avoid a specific type of chemical, or if the client is going for a indoor air quality certification and needs to ban the use of certain cleaning chemicals by the maintenance team, we could apply all of that within the model itself. And when we say extract quantities or information from the model, we can pull that information from each element itself and then develop specific operations and maintenance manuals for the building through that. Also within the model, you can preempt the lifespan of key equipment. So if you have a building management system, for example, you can tie maintenance schedules that are predictive rather than reactive. So instead of waiting for a key system to fill, you can tie in the intermittent checks to make sure that your team is addressing, whether it be the HVAC system or checking on generator, for example. You can tie that into the scheduling component of the facilities management with the building information model. In terms of building safety information, I'm not sure if you mean kind of disaster response. In terms of kind of creating a disaster response plan from a simulation, yes, but if you are talking about, I'm not sure, fire safety routes, that can be housed within the model as like a plan within the model itself, but I'm not exactly sure what you're asking or which one you're referring to. But I would summarize by saying that digital asset is like a cheat code for the building. It holds a plethora of data that you can overlay onto each element. You can tag elements as you see fit and incorporate all of that data and ensure that every trade within the project, whether it be MEP, whether it be the structural engineer, if it's the interior designer, they can all have access to this shared model, and any changes or upgrades to any element within that model would be tracked across everyone's scope and updated accordingly.
Excellent. So let me go to one other question that we have. Taking Port of Spain as an example, how realistic would it be to change commuting patterns for work through urban restructuring? And I guess this will go to you, Professor Michael.
Let me just have a look at the question again to make sure. It's at the very top.
Yeah, it's at the very top.
Taking Port Spain as an example, would it be to change commuting patterns to work or through urban restructuring? Right. So the capital of Port of Spain is really the center of state sector employment. So you have sometimes as much as 75% of state employees coming into the city of Port of Spain on a daily basis. That leads to about an average of 3 hours spent in traffic just going to work and another 3 getting home. So 6 hours of a person's lifetime spent per day on the roads in and out of the capital city. What has been discussed, especially in the post-pandemic era, is the need to look at the possibility of working from at home or a compressed work week. So you come into the office, work 4 days and add on an extra hour or 2. And so you don't necessarily need to come to work one of those days. So you put in your hours during the week by doing the extra 2 days, 4 days of a week, which will be 8 hours. Or that you can do some of your work online, and the digital technology certainly allows us that opportunity. So there is a digital solution. There is, in fact, a need to revisit other modes of transportation. And of course, there's a planning solution. When I say other modes of transportation, mixed modal, multimodal mix of transportation, using ferries to get people from the other secondary capital city to the main one and so on. But the planning one, and which we have advocated for many decades, is one of decentralization, where you have other urban centers being developed with enough opportunities within those regions so that you don't have everybody being drawn to this primate city that I referred to earlier. So it's a system of secondary centers, urban centers that can pull the pressure off the capital city. And that is a decision that has been long overdue.
Yes, because I could even, especially in the context of Barbados, I know Bridgetown used to be, it's the primate city. I also saw your study you did on Bridgetown and the impact of climate change, which I will definitely revisit after this call. But how we've actually repositioned the area of business activity to Warrens, which is much further inland. And so I would say less susceptible to sea level rise and some of the other impacts of climate change. And I'm just curious as to how widespread that strategy is across the rest of the Caribbean, because, well, I know Warrens right now is from a traffic perspective, anyone that comes to campus will tell you it is an absolute nightmare at certain points in the day. And that impact on, air quality, air pollution, which we are also interested in. But I know that urban planning goes a long way in that. How would other Caribbean countries, because I know a lot of the other Caribbean countries are not as flat as Barbados as well. So that may be also another constraint where that is. But I'm just curious as to how widespread that is across the rest of the Caribbean. Being that you mentioned decentralizing and having other urban centers, how widespread is that practice?
think certainly the bigger Caribbean communities in terms of geographic space can accommodate that kind of spatial redistribution of population and economic activity. Definitely Jamaica has the opportunity to do that. And I know the Urban Development Corporation is doing quite a bit of work in terms of developing other urban centers and even rural areas to take the pressure off of Kingston. Yeah. But where the territories are smaller, it may not make as much sense because of the cost of infrastructure to develop those other urban centers. So it requires much more rigorous cost-benefit analysis before you can embark on such a spatial solution. But I know that certainly in the case of Jamaica and Trinidad, it is an opportunity to reimagine what an urban landscape can look like.
Yeah, very interesting. And I think even in the concept of water, which is one of the most precious resources within the Caribbean, we have loads of seawater, but fresh water for most countries, potable water is really the challenge. And even in terms of the building design aspect of it, and also policy, within Barbados, we have rainwater tank is supposed to be at every property that's within, well, greater than 1,500 square feet. I think that's the limitation. And those properties do have rainwater tanks. Where the deficit is, however, is that those tanks are not usually plumbed back to the building for purposes like, flushing of toilets or irrigation of the land. So whilst the policy is there, that people still ascribe to it and get the tanks, the added benefit of having a tank and using the water is actually not leveraged. And that is, I think, a gap that we will have to definitely work on in terms of getting more of that water captured and then utilized on site so that people can reduce the demand and the pressure, particularly in the dry season when we have the challenges of, these wildfires and persons having to utilize more water to drink, to bathe, to do all these other things that come along with the hot weather that we can't necessarily avoid. So it's just interesting. And I think that we do have the opportunity to put in place some economical measures, but I think too strategically, we have to look at how we can do short-term, mid-term, and also a long-term analysis of where we can go in the future. So let me see if I'll take one last question because I know we've run over time quite a bit. I think this last one is related to what are some of the financial arrangements being used to finance resilient infrastructure in the Caribbean? Sustainability-linked bonds have been emerging as a favorable tool, and I've seen discussions on a new category of bonds called resilient bonds that aim to monetize avoided losses. Are these instruments at least on the agenda of local governments to look into raise funds for climate adaptation? Well, I know of the Bridgetown Initiative. That's something the Prime Minister is actively advocating for. And we also have Professor Avanish Prasad, who's the brainchild behind that. I know of the 5 Cs as well, the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, which is the agency that can access funds through the Green Climate Fund, which is one of the largest national funds. And that is not funds that particularly a person or an agency can get that funding. It actually has to come through the ministries of economic affairs within the national governments. So those are the 2 that I know of. Outside of that, I know that there are some emerging, if you want to call them, that's the term that they use, angel investor funding that are emerging in the Caribbean related to climate change. So the accelerator then is the Caribbean Climate Change Accelerator. There's that one, but I am not sure if there are many resilient infrastructure financial arrangements that currently exist, but maybe we will put that on to other persons with the relevant expertise in financing. So, so I wouldn't let this webinar go any more beyond the time. I really want to sincerely thank all of those who joined the call, and we will have this recording available. We're going to try to see how quickly we can get it posted. We've had some challenges with getting some of the recordings posted on the campus YouTube channel, which is the channel that we usually post our content on, but we'll try our best to work assiduously to get it up as soon as possible so that people can engage with the content and they can reach out as they see fit to the presenters and everyone involved. But on behalf of the Center for Biosecurity Studies, the Faculty of Social Sciences, the MARCOM, which is the Marketing and Communications Department of the campus, and also to SITS, who have so graciously provided us with the Zoom platform for us to have this webinar, I want to say thank you and bid you all a very warm, good afternoon. So take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye.